In the second video on the Air of Good Feelings, we'll look at the way the economy was changing, becoming more commercial, manufacturing, more integrated, and also look at how the country grew westward. In the Air of Good Feelings, the development of a national integrated economy continued as the old Jeffersonian ideal of a nation of independent, self-sufficient farmers sought to continue to fade. The War of 1812 had disrupted trade with British manufacturers, which stimulated American manufacturers to meet the demand. With the precedent set by Samuel Slater, who I had discussed earlier, and the growing use of steam power, also discussed earlier, the new businesses tended to be larger operations, increasingly owned by stockholders and corporations, and not the smaller businesses owned by individual people. Steam-powered factories, of course, required a large number of workers in one place. Each taught a specific skill, and they would repeat this specific task they were taught over and over again. Everybody worked together in sort of like an assembly line. No one was making the product in its entirety at home themselves, which is the way manufacturing had been done the way before. The transition from this older type of manufacturing to manufacturing in one place, sort of the factory system, was characterized by the outwork system, which grew in the early 1800s. It's an important step towards this new type of factory production. Businessmen would go into rural farming communities and teach young women the necessary skill in the production process, leaving the raw material with them. And when the women had completed this first step, the businessmen would then carry the product they had worked to the next farming house, where other young women had been taught the next necessary step in the production process. And when they completed their work on the product, the businessmen would then carry it to yet a third household, where rural women would do another step in the process. How many steps it took would go forth this way down the line. The process was continual, which was speeding up production significantly, as I say, kind of like an assembly line you would find in a factory. One of the first industries to develop the outwork system was the shoe industry. Entrepreneurial capitalists in Lynn, Massachusetts extended their shoe production network deep into the western countryside of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. They would buy leather and thread and bring it to the farm women, who would then stitch them together in the upper part of the shoe, the upper sections of the shoe. And then their merchant wagons would pick them up and carry these completed shoe sections back to Lynn for final assembly and shipment to the markets. In the growing textile industry, entrepreneurs did it a bit differently. They would begin at their mills along rivers, which used water wheels to comb the raw wool into shape. They would then take the finished wool into nearby farming communities to have women spin it into thread, yarn, or even clothes. It's not surprising that women were the focus of these manufacturers in the textile industry, because women had been solely responsible for producing clothes in the farming communities before that. Household weaving reached its peak in 1820, when over 12,000 outworkers produced cloths in New England alone. In time, of course, these women would start coming to the mills or production centers themselves, with the process of step-like production completed all in one place. And with the application of power sources like water and steam, these women were essentially the first factory workers. This developing outwork system really transformed the character of the agricultural economy in a way that Jefferson had never imagined. Now a wage was coming into the family's household, making self-sufficiency less important, and the family thus more integrated into the merchant capitalist market economy. Moreover, farmers began having less mixed crop agriculture, and began to raise one crop or grow one form of livestock that was needed for that nearby factory. And so, they became part of the supply chain and less self-sufficient farmers. As the outwork system began to transform America's economy, Americans were also very interested in their nationalistic Air of Good Feelings frenzy, and of course with the Louisiana Purchase, to spread America westward, and they were pouring over the Appalachian Mountains in numbers never seen before. Many of them came through the best gap in the mountains, the famous Cumberland Gap. It was an ancient geological notch about 1,600 feet deep through the Appalachian Mountain Range near the southern end of today's Virginia and Kentucky boundary. It was even compared to the Brenner Pass through the southern Alps or the Khyber Pass in Afghanistan and India. This pass had been used since the late 1700s and was now famous by its old name, the Wilderness Road. And it went from the Potomac River in Virginia into Kentucky, and had been made famous by a near mythical figure known as Daniel Boone, who had traveled it in the earlier in the 1700s. In reality, Boone had been just a guy hired by a wealthy Kentucky speculator to lead groups to cut a path along the route to his land that he wanted to settle. Whatever path they took, they always followed the path of least resistance. Obviously lower points, there's less climbing, and they didn't have to cross as many rivers. So, by the 1820s, the old Wilderness Road, first sort of popularized by Daniel Boone, was like a highway across the Appalachian Mountains, and people were pouring over it. Of course, people were pouring past the Appalachian Mountains in the south as well. Of course, throughout there of good feelings after Eli Whitney's cotton gin, the cotton industry continued to spread to the southwest, the area today of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And as noted before, this spread slavery into those areas. Of course, as thousands of people ventured across the Appalachian Mountains to the lands east of the Mississippi, there was growing interest in the lands west of Mississippi, which of course Jefferson had just purchased in Louisiana with the Louisiana Territory. And the first people that were interested in the trans-Mississippi West were the fur traders. These fur traders often ventured well into the Rocky Mountains and were often romanticized as mountain men, reckless and courageous outcasts who despised civilization and roamed the isolated wilderness. If you ever seen the movie Jeremiah Johnson, it depicts a character kind of like this. Anyway, it was a rough existence. 8 out of 10 of them quickly died, whether it was outraged Indians or grizzly bears, disease, alcoholism, or simply injury or starvation. More likely it was just the freezing winters in the Rockies. But mountain men were, as I say, mythical figures. These mountain men were often employed by fur trading companies. And the most famous fur trading company was owned by John Jacob Astor. He was the son of a minor official in Germany, and he arrived in America in 1784 with nothing. And he just made a fortune off the Trans-Mississippi fur trade. And I guess you could say in that way, he was like an early Horatio Alger story. He later went into real estate and died a multimillionaire in New York in 1848. Another famous fur company was run by William Henry Ashley. Ashley, you can see, would advertise in newspapers, and you can, up on the right, to enterprising young men calling for people to go out in the wilderness, and on the left you can see some of his correspondence. Ashley's company was famous because it organized an annual rendezvous between the trappers and Indians and all traders at Jackson Hole in northwestern Wyoming. It was kind of like a noisy market, a party, and a brothel all wrapped into one. Pelt buyers would arrive with blankets, guns, hardware, coffee, Tabasco, and whiskey, and return with a wealth of animal pelts. I should note that these new fur companies eventually would trap out the Rockies in the far west, much like the French had earlier trapped out the old Northwest Ohio territories. But these mountain men, these fur traders, one function they did do was they sort of opened up the Rocky Mountains in the far west, the Trans-Mississippian West. People were finding out from reports brought back from these mountain men what was actually out there. For example, one important trader was Jedediah Smith, and he discovered a path through the Rocky Mountains, which is absolutely essential getting to what later would be California and Oregon territory. Jedediah Smith's path through the Rockies was called the South Path in what's now southwestern Wyoming. And it's going to be the route taken by thousands of people in the 1840s. It was part of the California Trail and the Oregon Trail. So it's famous in history. In any event, this concludes the second video on how in the era of good feelings you not only see a growing national economy, an integrated economy, but an interest in growing westward.